Over the past 2 weeks, we've been asking what games are and whether the boundaries around them hold. We find that the magic circle is not the sealed space Heisinger described. Social life floods in and capital flows out, and the lines between play and work are contested. But those 2 weeks left a prior question unasked. Before we can ask who is inside the circle or what leaks through its walls, we need to ask who built it. And that's the question that this week's readings address, not about games specifically, but about technology in general. The core claim, shared by Winner and Bijker, is deceptively simple. The design of technical systems is a political act. Artefacts are not neutral vessels that human beings subsequently fill with values. They arrive already loaded. And to understand why online games are structured the way they are, in terms of who they welcome, who they exclude, what kinds of social life they make easy or hard, we need to understand how politics gets inscribed in design before any player arrives. So let's start with what seems like a common sense idea, that technology is neutral. The tool doesn't have politics, the person holding it does. A knife isn't violent, a camera isn't invasive, a social media platform doesn't radicalize anyone on its own. What matters on this view is how people choose to use these things. Both of this week's required readings, Langdon Winner and Bijker, are fundamentally about why that intuition, however comfortable, is wrong, or at least radically incomplete. So Winner opens with a puzzle. If you've driven on Long Island, New York, you might notice that the overpasses on certain parkways are unusually low. Barely 9 feet of clearance. That's too low for a bus. It turns out this wasn't by accident. Robert Moses, the urban planner who shaped mid-20th century New York, designed them that way deliberately. Buses couldn't use those parkways. Since buses were the primary transport for poor and black New Yorkers, those groups were effectively excluded from reaching Moses's public parks, without anyone ever passing a law that said so. Moses's bridges are Winner's opening example of what he calls technologies that embody politics. The political arrangement, racial and class segregation, isn't just expressed through technology, it's inscribed in concrete. And crucially, it outlasts its author. Moses's alliances have long since dissolved. Moses himself is dead, but the bridges are still there. Winner distinguishes 2 ways in which artefacts have political properties. The first is where specific design choices are made to achieve particular social effects, consciously or not. Moses's bridges are the clearest case because we know Moses's intention. But Winner is careful to point out that intentional conspiracy is not required. He gives us the example of agricultural mechanization. The mechanical tomato harvester, developed at the University of California, could only be operated economically at scale. Its $50,000 price tag meant that large agribusiness could afford it. Only large agribusiness could afford it. Between the early 60s and 1973, the number of tomato growers in California collapsed from around 4,000 to 600, and around 32,000 agricultural jobs disappeared entirely. No one sat in a room and decided to destroy smallholder farming. The politics was built into the economies. It was built into the economics of design, and it rippled outward. Winner's point is subtle. To recognise the political dimensions of a technology, you don't need to find a villain. You need to look at who the design serves and who it disadvantages structurally. The second kind is what Winner calls inherently political technologies, systems that by their very nature seem to require a political kind of social or political order to function. His paradigm case is nuclear weapons. As long as the bomb exists, it demands a centralized, rigidly hierarchical chain of command. You cannot run a nuclear arsenal democratically. Winner draws on Engels here, who made a similar argument about the factory and the railway. The coordination required by complex industrial machinery necessitates authority, hierarchy, and submission to centralised management. Whether this is truly necessary or merely historically contingent is a question Winner leaves somewhat open, but the core point stands. Some technologies do not sit comfortably in all social arrangements, and choosing them is, in a meaningful sense, choosing a form of political life. The broader conclusion Winner draws is that technologies function like legislative acts. The highway network, or a communication infrastructure, a digital platform. These are decisions that shape how people live, communicate, and relate to one another for generations. Yet they're typically made by engineers, corporations, and planners, not through democratic deliberation. If we only ever ask whether a tool is used well or badly, we miss a more interesting question. What kind of order does this tool presuppose? And whose interests did its design serve? Notice that this is the assumed player question in another register. Moses' bridge assumes a certain kind of user, one who arrives by car, not by bus. The game console marketed to boys in the 1980s assumes a certain kind of player. The competitive shooter whose default camera sits at shoulder height assumes a certain body. Winner gives us the tools to ask, of any design, who was imagined here and who was not. So if Winner asks what political work technologies do, Bijker, who is Dutch, which is why his name is a little bit difficult to pronounce, asks a prior question. Bijker asks, how do technologies come to be the way they are? And his answer is that technology does not develop autonomously, following some internal technical logic, but technology is socially constructed. Bijker calls the common alternative view that technology follows its own momentum and then impacts society, technological determinism. This is still the standard view for many people, and it's not only intellectually limited. Bijker argues it's empirically wrong. History doesn't support it. The development of the nuclear missile, for instance, cannot be explained by any internal logic of rocketry. It can only be explained by the specific institutional conflicts, strategic doctrines, and political relationships between the US and the USSR. The technology didn't determine those relationships. The relationships shaped the technology. Bijker's alternative is drawn from the sociology of scientific knowledge and what he calls SCOT, the social construction of technology. The core move is to describe technologies through the eyes of relevant social groups. The different people and institutions who interact with an artifact and who give it meaning. A nuclear reactor means something very different to a union safety officer or to an international relations analyst worried about proliferation. And also different to the residents of the nearest town weighing employment against contamination risk. There is no single intrinsic meaning to the artifact. Bijker calls this interpretive flexibility. From here, SCOT traces how this flexibility narrows. Through negotiation, controversy, and the exercise of power, the meanings attributed to an artifact converge. Some designs win out over others, and eventually a particular version stabilizes. Bijker calls this closure, the point at which an artifact is no longer contested, when it simply becomes the obvious way of doing things. And what underpins this process of closure is what he calls a technological frame, the shared set of assumptions, concepts, and practices that structure how a relevant social group thinks about and acts with the technology. This is where Bijker's argument connects back to Winner's productively. Scott explains how the politics get into the artifact in the first place. The design choices Winner identifies as politically loaded didn't come from nowhere. They came from processes of social construction in which different groups had unequal power to shape the outcome, and in which certain groups were not at the table at all. What Winner calls the political properties of an artifact are, for Bijker, the frozen traces of those earlier conflicts and negotiations. Bijker is careful not to overclaim. He resists the slogan, "all technology is political," on the grounds that it's true but not useful. The more important point is that technology and politics are co-constitutive. They shape each other, and that this relationship is always specific to context, particular artefacts, particular institutions, and particular moments. So I also included 2 other papers this week which are not required but optional. The first one is by Bruno Latour, Society Made Durable. So this paper gives us a different vocabulary for thinking about the same problem. Latour asks us to consider the hotel manager who attaches heavy metal weights to guest room keys. His guests keep walking off with the keys, whether from absent-mindedness or indifference. He tried signs, polite requests, even moral appeals. None of this works reliably, but once the keys are weighed down, the guests can't wait to return them. The material modification does the work that social norms and moral instruction could not. Latour uses this example to develop the idea that technology is society made durable. Social arrangements, obligations, norms, power relations are fragile. They depend on people remembering, complying, or being persuaded. But when those arrangements are inscribed into material objects, they become harder to ignore, harder to circumvent, and far more durable. The bridge that will never accommodate a bus is more reliable than a segregationist policy that could be reversed by legislation. The weight on the key is more reliable than the sign on the wall. Latour, in his argument, extends Winner's in an interesting direction. Winner shows us that artefacts embody politics. Latour gives us a mechanism, what he calls delegation. Human actors delegate their programs of action to non-human actants, who then carry them out with a persistence that no purely social arrangement can match. When we move through a world already full of such delegations, designed roads, built environments, or platform architectures, we find ourselves already enrolled in programs we did not choose, which precede us, and that shape what we can and cannot easily do. And finally, we have Tim Ingold's papers, 8 Themes in the Anthropology of Technology. So Ingold pushes back against a different assumption that runs through all of what we've spoken about. The idea that technology and society are useful, separable categories in the first place. Ingold's argument is that the separation of technology from social life is not a universal feature of the human condition. It is a historically specific product of Western modernity, and of what he calls a machine theoretical cosmology. In most human societies, and arguably in our own, technical relations are not external to social relations. They are embedded in them. You cannot understand a fishing net without understanding the kinship relations, seasonal obligations, and ecological knowledge of the people who make and use it. The tool is not opposed to the social world, but a part of it. If Ingold is right, then Winner and Bijker are not wrong exactly, but they are working with a concept of technology as discrete, separable, and analysable in relative isolation that already carries a particular ideological load. The framework for asking, do artefacts have politics, already presupposes that artefacts are the kinds of things that can be separated from the social relations in which they're embedded, examined, and then put back with politics or without it. Ingold's critique suggests that the more interesting questions might be about skill, practice, and making, about how people and their technical environments are constituted together, rather than about how political values get encoded into objects and structures. For an anthropology course, this is a useful corrective. The social construction of technology and the framework that Winner puts forward are primarily sociological. Ingold's intervention is to insist on the anthropological specificity of how different societies understand and relate to their technical worlds, and to warn against projecting a modern Western concept of technology onto contexts where it may not apply, or even onto Western contexts where it might elide other more interesting things going on. So where does this leave us? For the purposes of this course, thinking about digital games, online worlds, and the infrastructures through which social life increasingly happens, these readings set up a set of questions we'll be returning to all semester. Every piece of software, every platform, every interface carries built-in assumptions. Not because the engineers who made them are villains, but because they were people with particular positions in the world, particular ideas about what users want or need, particular institutional pressures and financial constraints. When a platform makes certain kinds of social interaction easy and others hard, when an algorithm surfaces certain content and buries other content, or when a game's control scheme presupposes a particular kind of body or a particular kind of hardware, these are all, in Winner's sense, political decisions. And they tend, in Bijker's sense, to become stabilised. That is, taken for granted, invisible, and seen as just the way things are. The question isn't whether to use tools, or whether the people using them are good or bad actors. The question is how to see the politics that has been made durable in the design, and to ask whose interest that design serves. So next week takes this argument down from the structural level to the phenomenological one. Winner asks, what does a design assume about its user? That is the assumed player question at the level of politics and infrastructure. Next week, Latte, Dovey and Kennedy and Bayliss ask, in their own ways, what happens in the actual body of an actual player when they pick up the interface the design produced? And what happens when the assumed player and the actual player are not the same person? When the body that arrives does not match the body the design imagined.